The intruder. Jennifer had always felt safe in her suburban home. Nestled in a quiet neighborhood, it was the last place she expected anything unusual to happen. One rainy evening, while her parents were out of town, she decided to stay in and enjoy a quiet night by herself. She made some popcorn, curled up on the couch, and started watching a horror movie. Halfway through the film, she heard a faint tapping sound. At first, she thought it was just the rain against the window, but as the sound grew louder and more insistent, she muted the TV and listened carefully. The tapping continued, now clearly coming from the back door. Her heart raced as she crept towards the kitchen, where the door was located. She could see the silhouette of a man standing outside. Panic set in. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, whispering her address to the operator. The intruder began to jiggle the door handle, trying to get in. Jennifer ran upstairs to her bedroom, locking the door behind her. She could hear the operator's voice assuring her that the police were on their way. The minutes felt like hours as she sat in the darkness, clutching her phone. Suddenly, she heard the sound of breaking glass. The intruder had smashed a window and was now inside the house. She could hear his footsteps moving through the kitchen, then the living room. He was getting closer. Desperate, Jennifer opened her window and prepared to climb out onto the roof. But before she could, the footsteps stopped right outside her bedroom door. She held her breath, hoping he would move on. Instead, the door handle slowly turned. The intruder was trying to get in. Just as the door began to open, she heard the sound of sirens approaching. The intruder cursed and ran back downstairs. Moments later, she heard the front door slam shut. Jennifer stayed in her room until she heard the police calling her name. They found her shaking with fear but unharmed. The intruder had disappeared into the night, but the police assured her they would do everything they could to find him. Jennifer knew she would never feel truly safe in her home again. The unseen presence. Michael was used to living alone. He enjoyed the solitude of his small house on the edge of town. But lately, he had been feeling uneasy, as if someone was watching him. He chalked it up to his imagination, but the feeling persisted. One night, as he was getting ready for bed, he heard a strange noise coming from the attic. It sounded like footsteps. Michael tried to convince himself it was just the house settling, but the noise continued, growing louder and more distinct. Armed with a flashlight, he decided to investigate. He pulled down the ladder to the attic and climbed up, his heart pounding in his chest. The attic was dark and dusty, filled with old boxes and forgotten belongings. He swept the beam of the flashlight around but saw nothing unusual. Just as he was about to leave, he heard a whisper. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it sent chills down his spine. He turned around, shining the light into the darkest corner of the attic. There, he saw a shadowy figure standing still. Frozen with fear, Michael could only stare. The figure didn't move or make a sound, but its presence was menacing. Gathering his courage, he stepped forward, but as he did, the figure vanished. It was as if it had never been there. Shaken, he hurried back down the ladder and locked the attic door. That night, he slept with the lights on, but he could still feel the unseen presence watching him. The following days were filled with strange occurrences. Objects would move on their own, doors would open and close, and he would hear whispers in empty rooms. One evening, he found a note on his kitchen table. It wasn't there when he left for work, and he lived alone. The note simply read, "I'm still here." Terrified, Michael called a friend to stay with him. Together, they searched the house but found nothing. Despite his fear, Michael refused to leave his home. He contacted a paranormal investigator, hoping to find answers. The investigator spent a night in the house and confirmed that there was indeed a presence, but it was not malicious. It seemed to be a lost soul seeking peace. With the investigators' help, Michael performed a cleansing ritual, hoping to release the spirit. Afterward, the strange occurrences stopped, and the house felt lighter. But Michael knew he would never forget the terror of those nights, nor the feeling of being watched by an unseen presence. The haunting melody. Emily loved playing the piano. It was her escape, her passion. When she moved into her new house, she was delighted to find an old, grand piano left by the previous owners. She spent hours playing it, losing herself in the music. One night, after a long practice session, she went to bed, leaving the piano open. Around midnight, she was awakened by the sound of someone playing a haunting melody. She sat up, listening intently. The notes were beautiful but eerie, and they seemed to be coming from the piano downstairs. Confused and frightened, Emily grabbed a baseball bat and crept down the stairs. As she approached the living room, the music stopped. She entered the room to find the piano lid closed, just as she had left it. Shaking her head, she convinced herself it was just a dream and went back to bed. The next night, the same thing happened. She was jolted awake by the same haunting melody. This time, she rushed downstairs, but again, the music stopped as soon as she entered the room. Determined to find the source, she set up a video camera to record the piano overnight. The following morning, she reviewed the footage. At precisely midnight, the keys began to move on their own, playing the same melody she had heard. There was no visible presence, but the music was unmistakable. Terrified, Emily showed the video to a friend, who suggested the piano might be haunted. Unwilling to give up her beloved instrument, Emily researched the history of the house and the piano. She discovered that the previous owner had been a renowned pianist who died tragically in the house. It was said that she had been composing a final piece of music when she passed away. Determined to help the restless spirit, Emily decided to learn the unfinished piece. She spent weeks practicing, playing the haunting melody over and over. Finally, one night she felt ready. She sat at the piano and played the piece in its entirety, adding her own touches to complete it. As the final note echoed through the house, she felt a strange sense of peace. The air seemed lighter, and for the first time in weeks, she slept soundly. The nightly music stopped, and the piano remained silent. Emily continued to play, but she never forgot the haunting melody or the spirit that had sought her help. She felt honored to have completed the piece, bringing peace to the soul of the previous owner and restoring tranquility to her home. The night visitor. James had always been a night owl. He enjoyed the quiet and solitude of the late hours, finding it the perfect time to read and relax. One night, as he sat in his favorite armchair with a book, he heard a faint scratching sound coming from the basement. Annoyed, he assumed it was a rat or some other pest. He grabbed a flashlight and headed down the creaky stairs. The basement was dimly lit, filled with old furniture and boxes. He scanned the room with the flashlight but saw nothing unusual. The scratching sound continued, now louder and more insistent. It seemed to be coming from behind an old bookshelf. James moved the shelf aside, revealing a small door he had never noticed before. Curious, he opened it, revealing a narrow, dark passage. Against his better judgment, he entered the passage, the scratching sound growing louder with each step. The passage led to a hidden room, empty except for an old trunk in the corner. The sound was now coming from the trunk. Heart pounding, James opened the trunk to find an old, tattered diary. The pages were filled with the frantic scribbles of someone clearly disturbed. The last entry sent chills down his spine. The visitor comes at night. I can hear him scratching, trying to get in. I don't know how much longer I can keep him out. As he read the words, the scratching stopped. The basement was deathly silent. James hurried back upstairs, closing the door behind him. That night, he locked every door and window, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next night, the The scratching returned, louder and more persistent. It seemed to be coming from inside the walls. James tried to ignore it, but the noise was maddening. Desperate, he decided to stay in a hotel, leaving the house empty for the night. When he returned the next morning, he found the house in disarray. Furniture was overturned, and the walls were scratched and gouged. It was as if a wild animal had rampaged through his home. He called the police, but they found no signs of forced entry. Terrified, James contacted a paranormal expert who investigated the house. The expert discovered that the house had a dark history. The original owner had been a recluse who believed he was being haunted by a malevolent spirit. He had built the hidden room and passage to escape the nightly visits. The expert performed a cleansing ritual, hoping to banish the spirit. For a while, the house was quiet, and James began to feel a sense of normalcy returning. But the peace was short-lived. One night, as he lay in bed, he heard the scratching again. This time, it was right outside his bedroom door. Trembling, he grabbed his flashlight and crept towards the door. The scratching stopped abruptly. He swung the door open, but there was nothing there. Only the faint echo of the sound remained. Determined to confront whatever was haunting him, James went down to the basement once more. The hidden door was open, and the narrow passage seemed to beckon him. With his heart pounding, he entered the passage and followed it to the hidden room. The trunk was open, and the diary was gone. In its place, a small, worn-out music box sat. Hesitant but curious, James wound it up and let it play. The haunting melody that emerged sent chills down his spine. Suddenly, the room grew cold, and he felt a presence behind him. Turning slowly, he saw the faint outline of a man. The figure was barely visible, like a shadow in the darkness. It moved towards him, and James felt an overwhelming sense of dread. He tried to back away, but his feet were rooted to the spot. The figure stopped a few feet away, its hollow eyes fixed on James. In a voice barely more than a whisper, it spoke. "You shouldn't have opened the door." With those words, the figure vanished, and the room warmed up again. James ran back upstairs, slamming the hidden door behind him. He knew he couldn't stay in the house any longer. The presence was too powerful, too malevolent. He packed a few essentials and left, never to return. The house was eventually sold, but the new owners reported strange occurrences almost immediately. The scratching, the cold spots, the feeling of being watched. Everything James had experienced continued to plague the house. James moved far away, hoping to leave the nightmare behind. But sometimes, late at night, he still hears the faint sound of scratching, a reminder that some spirits are not so easily left behind.